about who I am and where I come from. I've only been back in Akron for about 2.5 years. I did my master's here. The University of Akron, I don't know if you're all familiar with the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics, founded in honor of Ray Bliss, who was chair of the RNC. Nixon got rid of him, so he helped Nixon, and then he came back to Akron. And so they endowed an institute. It's dedicated to promoting civic and political engagement. My predecessor, who was there for 35 years, John Green, so I have big shoes to fill. He was there for 35 years, and his focus on fulfilling Ray Bliss's mission focused with a Master's of Applied Politics. And it really focused, the Institute up until now has, and will continue to focus on preparing people for public service professions, and in particular the things that promote voting and participation: consultants, campaign managers, people who work for the parties, people who organize and get out the vote. But what I promised to do when I stepped in was to maintain that legacy. John Green was my advisor, by the way. I got my degree from that program in '94, before I went on for my Ph.D. But what I promised to do at my interview, and then have been working to try to do, is to say things have changed since 1994, when I came through. And we had a much richer civic infrastructure, natural political socialization to where people learned civic duty and obligation along with the civic skills was still there. We had a rich network of organizational life and civic life. We didn't have TikTok and misinformation to the extent that we have it now. It is so much harder to get robust, healthy political socialization for good citizenship, right? So if we're going to focus on promoting civic and political engagement at the Institute and under my directorship, we need to not only train people for professions, but we need to train people for citizenship. And so we're layering in some new initiatives to do that. And if you're curious or interested in any of that, I'm happy to talk about that later. But I thought I'd talk about, like, one of the things people have been asking me to talk about when I come in to speak has been, like, how are the polls off again? How did we, we knew it was a possibility that Trump would win, but not really, we didn't think it would, that all the battleground states would go for Trump, that it would be, it's not a landslide. It's definitely not a landslide, but that it would look so red when you look at the Electoral College map. And how did that happen, that the pollsters and the political consultants and sort of the political class were sort of whiffing it again? So I wanted to talk to you about that and sort of what did happen and why it happened and played out the way it did, and then kind of think about where do we go from here. So it is true that the pollsters have had a huge problem over the past couple of election cycles getting it right. One of the reasons they're having trouble getting it right is polling is based on polling a true random sample, right? And so we can, with about 2,000 random samples, randomly drawn people from any population, we can, usually there's a 5% chance that it's just totally wrong, like that you just pulled the random sample that is just a fluke, right? Just a bunch of people that are not typical. So there's a 5% chance that it's completely wrong anytime you do a poll. But then even within that 5%, there's the number that they give you, like, 47% for Harris or 50% for Trump, is their best estimate within a range, right? Which would be called the margin of error. They always said it was a margin of error race. So when you hear a margin of error race, it's like the two numbers are too close together that no one's over, right, even what a good poll would do. We're having trouble figuring out how to pull a true random sample in ways that are not incredibly expensive right now in the polling industry. So we used to do it, back when I was trained how to do polls, everybody had a landline. Anybody who was going to vote had a landline, right? If you didn't have a landline, you were too poor and off the grid to worry about. And so the way that we used, when I was trained at the University of Akron to do polling, you build a list, and you would even be able to you just know all the residential numbers, even if they were unlisted. You could put them together and know what they were, and you could pull a true random sample from any geographic area because we still had landlines. I have a 518 area code because that's where I went to grad school and got in New York and got my first cell phone. How many people, I don't have a landline for the first time ever. When I moved to Akron, I just was like, I don't need to pay for that. How many people, when you're when you're on your phone and you see a number that you don't recognize pop up, don't answer it? Or if it's coming from a pollster, it says spam likely, right? And to the extent that we do that, the young, my 20-year-old students are like, why are you calling me? Why isn't this a text? You can't call me, that's rude, right? They don't even want phone calls. So the old-fashioned way of doing this is really hard. Now, what we did a poll. The Bliss Institute paid for a poll, a lot of money for a poll this cycle, and we think we got things pretty accurate. We did it by sending people first. We hired Seymour, which is a marketing firm from a former alum as well in Akron local. And what we did was we sent a letter. We pulled a random sample, and we sent a letter. We pulled a random sample of registered voters in Ohio, so we got it from the Board of Elections, or the Secretary of State, and then we sent a letter, snail mail, to their houses and said, if we send you a link, like we're from the University of Akron, blah, 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 like if we send you a link to an online questionnaire, will you please fill it out? Because people are now actually more likely to open an envelope than they are, and how would you put it together with their phone? It's incredibly expensive because then you have all of these layers of steps that you have to take, and many people who are doing polling, they're trying to make money, unlike us who are trying to get it right, and right? they're trying to get it right but also make money, and it's just really expensive. And so they take shortcuts. They'll do things like YouGov is a prominent polling company. They just have a huge number of people that they already know and have recruited and have agreed across the United States to fill out polls. And they do it by demographics. And so you'll get like Amazon points to spend money like on a gift card at Amazon if you fill out their poll. And then they just weight you, right? Like, oh, you're an educated woman in Northeast Ohio. And then they just weight the data so that you're representing people who have similar characteristics in Northeast Ohio. It is not a random sample, right? But it's a lot cheaper. And so there's just lots of playing around. So I don't know how long the polling industry, because it's expensive to do it right and in ways that actually give you more accurate results, I don't know how long they can make money and continue to be accurate. Okay, so even with doing a good random sample, we would have trouble, and we would once again underestimated Trump support, right? Everybody thought even punditry, if you're watching online, we thought that, that the prominent Republicans coming out, Dick Cheney, Lynn Cheney, Kinzinger, others, Mike Pence withheld his support. There was a thought that Trump had more of a ceiling this time because people would think that his behavior was disqualifying. And that seemed to be playing out, right? No one anticipated that he would actually increase, right? But like maybe he'll get what he got last time. No one anticipated that he would get 2 million more votes and that he would win the popular vote. How does that happen? All right, so even if you're doing a good random sample, and you're thinking about the kind of people that are typical, Trump supporters, we have polling data that looks at Trump supporters in Ohio. They are much distrustful, right? The Fox News and the conservative media outlets encourage them to be distrustful of experts. It encourages them to be distrustful of academics. It encourages them to be distrustful of anyone who calls and says, I'm calling from a university or I'm calling from a polling firm and I'd like you to answer a question. And so they are just much, much less likely to say yes. So even as you're trying to pull that random sample and you've randomly sampled and you're pulling someone in, they get much lower response rates from people who are self-opting out, even if they would even bother to pick up the phone, right? So they're opting out, and then what the pollsters have to do is make decisions of the handful of people who are MAGA or are Trump supporters. They have to make some decisions about how to weight, how much do their answers represent the people who didn't answer the phone. The people who answer the phone are much more likely to be trustful, right? Much more likely to not be have animosity, and so the people who aren't answering the phone or choosing not to participate are the ones who are angry and going to come in and vote like a straight Republican ticket and not be persuaded to split their ticket for Bernie Moreno, right? The other people that were and so MAGA is going to be motivated, the Make America Great or the Trump sort of base of the party, they're going to be motivated to show up and vote and participate kind of no matter what, but they underestimated the intensity, right, and the likelihood of that turning out. Now, who did Trump pick up? Who were these 2 million voters, right, that were the uptick? This is what we're thinking is happening. There's an increasingly what political scientists are starting to call the diploma divide, right? So everyone's talking about, minority men, were breaking for Trump, or not enough white women were, flipping for Harris, and that he was making increases with Latino men. If you run the crosstabs, it's not really the demographics that are driving, right, those voters toward Trump. It was, if you ran the crosstabs, it was people who had those characteristics but also had low socioeconomic status, like high school education or less, and making, we pay our admins at the University of Akron $15 an hour, right? People making, right, like very low amounts of money, right? And so what we're thinking, like, why would he pick up with those voters are also hard to poll, because if you're making minimum wage, you're probably working 2 jobs and you're probably working 80 hours a week. And right, and so even if you're not hostile or have animosity, you're just like, I'm busy, why would I, right, I don't have time to do this, and you're moving on. Why would those voters with low economic status be so attracted right now, and in particular in this election cycle, to the Trump campaign? And if you put it in historical context, the midterm election really gave Democrats a false sense of security in how much pushback there would be against Trump. If you look at the historical headwinds of sort of what the trends were happening post-pandemic, not in the United States, but worldwide, any place there was a democracy and an election, look at Western Europe. The only incumbent that held on was Macron, because he was up against, right, he was up against Le Pen, who was, whose father was truly so far right that it's unacceptable to the French public, right? And so everyone everywhere else in Europe, because of the cost of living increases, because of the post-pandemic inflation, which even as a president is really hard to control when people were sitting on money for a couple of years, right? And there's this pent-up desire to spend. Everywhere else in Europe where there was an election, aside from France, they threw the incumbent political party out, whether they were conservative or liberal. It was absolutely about the economy, and it was absolutely about throwing them out. And so the exit polling that we've managed to get our hands on post-pandemic for what that bump up was, it was largely people who are remembering 2016 and the prices and the way that they could pay their bills in 2016, and thinking that they're going to get that back, right? And thinking that they're going to get that back. And Biden's messaging on Biden did a wonderful job keeping inflation under control given the historical circumstances. The policies that have come through, I don't know, there's like 33,000 infrastructure projects, the Green New Deal, the infrastructure bill. It does not feel real to people making $15 or less dollars an hour when they can't pay rent, or they can't buy what they used to buy with their money, and they don't have unions anymore that are negotiating their salary increases, right, and that are bumping it up to manage it. And so we think that if there had not been those historical headwinds, and Biden was tone deaf when he talked about the economy, and talking about, because he did do a good job and was proud of it, but it just did not feel real to anyone. I don't like it, but I can still go buy a new washer and dryer when mine break, even though I don't like the prices that I'm paying now, and I remember paying less, but I can absorb it, and they can't. So, right, so and this is hindsight is 2020, and who knows if this would have actually made a difference. If the Democrats had gotten more of a drubbing in the last midterm, and Biden had not been so overconfident, because that was the tipping point where he decided to not resign, right, was the last midterm, and thinking that he had, enough, I'm a really popular president, I can pull this off. If he had actually resigned after one term, and there'd been an open primary, where he would have, the candidate who would have probably made it through would have been someone who would have been openly critical of the Biden administration's performance on the economy and serving, that lower strata of the electorate. I mean, Harris tried to do it, right? She talked about the opportunity economy, and she talked about all those things, but people were like, but you're his vice president, and we don't believe you, and you said he didn't do anything wrong. And she really couldn't be strident and critical enough, especially in such a condensed election cycle, to have authenticity on that issue, right? And so, and then the younger generation that is struggling, Gen Z that is struggling, was in middle school. This is I have to remind myself. The younger generation, to the extent that there was some young Gen Z that flipped and voted for Trump, and in particular young men at some higher levels, they were in middle school and they do not remember the first Trump administration, right? So when Trump says, I'm going to fix it, they don't have any reason not to believe him, right? So that's kind of what we think. So Trump doesn't, of course, the Make America Great Again and the Trump supporters, they do support many of the more strident, deportation and tariffs and, some of the, gutting the Department of Education. They do support some of those more strident, policy agendas because they're Trump through and through. But the things that bumped him over to win and the things that bumped him up to just squeak by and get the popular vote, it's not even over 50%, but he does have the popular vote, are not going to be popular with people who voted for him because they want more money in their pockets, right? So what happened with Harris? Why did we whiff and not get the Harris vote right? And we're thinking about, in particular, the Iowa poll that came out that showed that, that she had a really strong chance of actually winning Iowa. Who answers the phone? Older women answer their phones. Educated older women answer their phones. Educated older women who are angry and want to tell you what they're going to do about it answer their phones, right? And so there was an over-performance, of people who, I'll talk to, you invited me on, y'all invited me here today to hear what I say. I'll talk to a university professor. I'll fill out the public opinion poll from someone who's trained to do that work. I want to tell you why I'm upset and angry. I'm happy to answer my phone. So they get put in, and the authentic answers in the attempt to do a random sample get weighted at much higher, at much higher rates. So we think that that's likely what happened, is that, the kind of people who were likely to support Harris, given this diploma divide, and given in particular that women of certain education status and professional women were pretty angry still in this election, that they got overrepresented and kind of put a thumb on the scale, even though pollsters are trying to do the right thing. The other thing that happened is there was just lack of enthusiasm for Harris, So we know that about 1 in 6, she underperformed Biden all over the place. About 1 in 6 people that came out and supported Biden sat this one out. And so it's really hard. It's hard for me to know as a social scientist why, because you didn't vote, so I don't have an exit poll. How do I find you? How do I find the people who didn't vote to ask them why? But we do know that I would suspect that some low socioeconomic status voters that are Democrats didn't believe Harris when she said she was going to fix the economy and help them get a mortgage, and right, it did not feel real to them. That message was not. She didn't have time. Maybe wasn't the right messenger. So there's some drop off there. Like people are just like not enthusiastic. And then we know, because they bragged about it, that there was Palestinian protest vote. I was watching the polls come in, the votes come in. I was on Idea Stream on the air. How do you like that? Wow. Live on the air for Idea Stream on election night, watching the votes come in and like trying to look and figure out what was happening. We were looking. I'm at this point still. I spent the bulk of my career in Michigan, so I can pick out counties in Michigan that are bellwether better than I can in Ohio at this point. So I was like, what's happening in Dearborn? Like, what's happening in like some of the places around Wayne County? And you saw in Muslim-dominated communities huge Jill Stein votes and low turnout. And then people behind those protests, the Palestinian protest, actually came out the week after the election and bragged and that they had cost Harris the state of Michigan at least, possibly some other battleground states, by either encouraging people to sit home or to vote for Jill Stein. And so that pulled off some support. And then again, I don't have any academic or hard data on this because it's hard to research people and they wouldn't tell me the truth anyways. But we know from other theories and other research that it was inevitable that there would be some drop off because she was an African American woman, right? That women struggle with. It's hard for women when they are ambitious and put themselves forward and say, I should be the leader. That is a masculine agency, right, coded as masculine in agency, and it makes people not like women. Women have to do this balance. Even still, the women who are most influential are women who are likable, and you achieve likability by performing traditional femininity, and traditional femininity is tied to being a resource for other people. Sugar and spice and what would you like, right? How can I help you? And so when you have to perform femininity to be liked, but you have to perform agency and leadership and direction to be perceived as competent, it is a huge tight walk for women that are, right? It's much easier to be nominated to be prime minister because you've got a relationship with your peers in the legislature who bump you up. It is a lot harder task for American women to win the presidency or the governorship. Right? It's just a tight walk. And so I don't have any hard data on that because how do I find these voters, interview them, and then actually get them to admit that this implicit kind of bias that they might not even really want to recognize or admit themselves is kind of holding them back. But I would say that there's at least a piece of that. So those are the things that we think happened. And then what are the implications? This is absolutely why Bernie Moreno won and Sherrod Brown didn't pull it off. Our poll showed women in Ohio. Women were slightly breaking for Trump in Ohio, and they didn't. When you looked at the Senate race, they're not the same number of women were not supporting Bernie Moreno. They weren't necessarily supporting Sherrod Brown, but they were undecided. Very late in the race, they were sitting on their support. Even Republican women were sitting on their support for Bernie Moreno, and lots of people were splitting their ticket. And we were even looking at Mahoney County, and lots of people were splitting their ticket, and Moreno was underperforming Trump. So if Trump hadn't overperformed with low propensity voters, low education, low socioeconomic status voters, who are only there to vote for Trump. And they're going to vote the rest of the ticket by downloading the sample ballot, and they're not going to split their ticket, and they're not going to make these nuanced choices, and they're going to download the sample ballot, and they're just going to vote that straight ticket. So if there hadn't been that motivation from that little bump from low SES that Trump got from low propensity voters, Sherrod Brown still would have pulled this one off. So that, right, if it wasn't a presidential election year, we might have had another Sherrod Brown 6 years. And then I also think that affected Not entirely. We know there were some confusing language issues with the ballot initiative, but those low propensity voters that printed out the sample ballot did the same thing on issue 1. They're just they don't even read it. They're just like, this is what Trump and the Republican Party want me to do, and they're just and it's just enough that it tips it over. So that's sort of, I think, a less distressing story than saying that there was a mandate for much of the things that we might find disturbing. And then what do I think that we need to do? So I teach this stuff all the time. I don't know that there are, the things that I tend to focus on are long-term solutions. And I wish that there was a quick fix. But I mean, for one thing, I would say, my gosh, please continue I was so thrilled to hear your membership is going up. Please continue to do what you are doing and recruit people into the League of Women Voters to do this work. One of the things, my students are like, how are we losing democracy? Or how are we, not losing, but like eroding, a little backsliding. We're not losing it yet. We got a ways to go. But like, why is things such a mess, right? My students always want to know. And I go back, if you go back and look at early political theory and you look at early political observers of the United States who were stunned, right? They thought we would crash and burn in Europe when they were watching us try to pull off a democracy. And anyone who came here said it's because of their associational life. It is because of the organized public sphere where we had a nation of joiners, right? And anytime Americans cared about anything in their community or cared about politics, they formed organizations, and in particular in a political structure like we have federated structures. So, and we might just be focused on, those organizations might just be focused on philanthropy or on recreation during most of the time. But if you are an organized infrastructure and you get mad about something in politics, you already know how to organize and the infrastructure's there, and and we had this rich overlapping network up through the 1960s, maybe early 1970s. Americans joined everything. And we've had generational erosion in joining this kind of organization to the point where my students are confused by what it even is, right? So I teach about civil society and the organized public sphere. Some of the early sort of political observers that came here from France, like, how are you doing this without a guillotine? Like, how did you, right? Came to like, how is this stable in the United States? Said it's because Americans excel at the art of organizing, and this is what he meant, right? The willingness to pay dues, have subcommittees, and that's like, show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. It's boring meetings and paying dues and subcommittees. Right? And
Preach it.
And this is where people learn civic identity and civic skills. Civic identity, because who wants to read a newspaper to know what's going on? Right. Well, you got to read them online. But, right? Who wants to do the work to be educated and to deliberate with people who disagree with you and do this hard work unless you intrinsically feel guilty because you know your peers are judging you if you don't do it. This is what we produce, right?
That's right.
And the civic skills to be able to do it, right? And so I teach this to my students. I have a class. I'm wrapping it up. I just taught my last night class this week called Civic Engagement and Political Participation, which is all about how the erosion of, if you want to know what's wrong with the political information environment, it comes back to this. If you want to know what's wrong with campaigns and elections and why that's a problem, it comes back to this. So we start with the erosion of civic infrastructure and all of the clubs and groups and organizations and why that happened, and then talk about crap rolls downhill, right? Like how that's been damaging to everything else. So I would say rebuilding, and I'm trying to help. I'm getting ready to write a textbook so that other people can also teach that and reteach about voluntary associations and joining, so it won't just be me at the University of Akron. But we need to reinvigorate the public sphere and organized, educated. I can teach all day long. I can teach Intro to American Government with all the passion and all the energy in the world, and people will have knowledge. They will not have intrinsic civic identity, and they will not have skills. That's what they get from you, right? And so, we need an organized public sphere of people who understand their civic obligation and know how to do it. And most of the time, it's a curse to live in interesting times. Most of the time, politics should be boring, right? Do we want this option or that? What should our philanthropy this year be? How do we want to spend our dues money? How do we want to spend which good infrastructure projects should we prioritize with our tax dollars? Most of the time, politics should be boring. If you have the existing civic infrastructure when politics is not boring, you can use the exact same skill set to launch nonviolent civil disobedience, right? And organize it and do it well. And if you're looking at South Korea right now, there's research, there's a really good book by a colleague at Harvard called Nonviolent Civil Disobedience, or Nonviolent Civil Disobedience, What Everyone Needs to Know, I think it's called. It came out a couple years ago. It only takes 3% of the population to participate in nonviolent civil disobedience to topple a dictator. Wow. Because you can shut it down. Hyundai workers are on a general strike in South Korea until their president resigns right now. And it's going to happen as long as they hold out, right? But it takes this ability to know how to organize this. It helps so much if this is already here and pre-existing. That's keep it up. That's what I would say. You're doing the right things. I love that you're on college campuses, and we need to figure out how to get the young people to come join us and pay dues and be part of this. Yeah. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh.
I saw your hand first.
Yeah, we ran into so much this year about university administrators really worried about doing anything with voting for fear that the legislature would come back and haunt them. So we were trying through the league to get the van to come, that was all tricked out, and our own president was behind it for like 2 years. And we had to wait till The Ohio State University said yes to having that vote now. It's not partisan. Show up at Ohio State before 3 or 4 of the administrations, including ours at Kent State, would say yes. How do you get to that level of administration to make them understand that civil and civic discourse is really needed if democracy is going to continue long term?
Can you repeat that question? Yeah, sure. How do we get, there was pushback from higher administration at Kent, I presume, and other universities about even allowing the league on campus to help students in a nonpartisan voter registration drive because they're worried about pushback. One of the things I would remind them of is that any university that takes federal funding, including federal subsidized aid, is subject to the Help America Votes Act, and they are legally required to help their students register to vote and participate in elections.
I did point that out.
Yeah, and so we're trying to help them fulfill something that they are legally required to do. There is actually there are college presidents who have signed on to a new initiative. And you might want to point that out to them. The president of Cleveland State has signed on to it. It's I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's Citizen Scholars, I think it's called, is the organization. But there's a new initiative with college presidents who have signed on and said that they are going to recommit to their civic mission and they are going to help their students, participate in politics. So it's not as it's one thing it's one thing, like, even if I had decided that I wanted to bring Lynn Cheney to campus and to be a speaker or something like that, I would get pushback for that, right? Because Republicans on my campus would say you're putting your thumb on the scale during an election season and you want her to tell your students how to vote, and she would have, right? But registering people to vote in a nonpartisan voter registration drive is pretty benign. And so, in terms of what they can get in trouble for. So we just need to continue to push back on that narrative. Yeah, just continue to push back on that narrative.
I can't help but feel that if we quit paying administrators at the higher ed, the corporate level incomes that we pay them, they're not protecting political life, they're protecting themselves. And I think we have gotten so out of balance with that's why we receive this discourse.
We're about to see a big cut at state administrators, but yeah.
Yeah, please.
How do we look at what possibly might happen with the whole issue of a subsequent Trump term, kind of with this whole question of, okay, there was, not a term, and it's not 2 consecutive Trump terms, it's a Trump by Trump. How do we look at that, and what are people saying about that?
That he'll pick up where he left off, or
No, that there'll be a push for a 3rd term, or no elections.
right? Yeah, I'll repeat that. Is there a concern that there will be a push, given that Trump wouldn't get to serve back-to-back terms, that there will be a push to either not have elections or to allow him to run for another consecutive term, given that he was disrupted. Disrupted in between, right? Like that Biden was there, right? So I'm not saying that those things won't happen. And I think it depends on whether the Trump administration is, how would Trump, it would go to the Supreme Court, right? It would go to the Supreme Court to make a decision, right? Right, and they would have to blatantly ignore the 22nd Amendment and reinterpret it. The Supreme Court already has such diminished public support right now that I'm not sure that even John Roberts would be willing to push it that far on Trump's behalf. And then in terms of just not having an election, how would that happen? You'd have to declare what the South Korean president just tried to do, declare some kind of state of emergency that requires military intervention and so forth. We have civic infrastructure in the United States has eroded, and it is not what it used to be, but it's not gone, right? People still have freedom of speech, people still have rights of association, and lots of people, look at all the people here, but then there are other kinds of organizations that mobilize and organize people all over the country. You still have Democratic governors. The elections are held at the local and state level. I would think that we have enough in the tank to keep that at bay. Yeah. Please.
Well, I was watching Cherie Strachan on PBS. I don't know if you caught it or not. It was a great interview that he did with Amanda Boz. And they were asking him about his thoughts, and he was so candid because I think he could finally relax. But most of what he was saying was about, and I'm baffled with this too, is how we lost the workers. We lost people that are working that I feel like they voted against their interests. And I think Cherie Strachan has a track record of being pro-worker, unions and all the things that you think should have pushed him better than working against Bernie Moreno. And so I'm looking at and that used to be our core support as far as Democrats go, right? That was something that we always looked at, and we lost them. They somehow went, or I'm not saying we as legal women voters, but we as a Democratic Party lost those voters to probably the most opposite of what would be their interests. So when we talk about university, I think it's great, but we have this whole group, and Fox News is their education system,
Yeah. So I teach. You need to come take my class. I teach about this all semester long. You can take it online. It's hybrid. So basically, this is a long-term trend. The Democratic Party lost the white working class, big chunks of the white working class, with not even with LBJ, right? With LBJ. And so you lose big chunks of the white working class, you lose the South in particular, and there's a rolling realignment, right? And we want to say it's just the South, but it wasn't. It was also Macomb, Michigan. It was also certain suburbs in Ohio, right? And an erosion. And there's, at the same time that happened, we also experienced the erosion of organizing. And so organizations like this, but also labor unions, were places where if you're not going to get a college degree, where else are you going to be heard and have a megaphone if this kind of organization? My grandpa worked in an oil refinery in Western Pennsylvania. He came to the United States when he was 13 to avoid working in the coal mines. I'm not sure if he had a high school diploma. I don't know. He was an Oddfellow. And he became president of his local Oddfellows organization as an adult. And he was in that organization with doctors and lawyers who treated him with respect and listened to him and understood his lived experiences. And he had a labor union. And when that megaphone got politics, Democrats have continued to try to respond to the working class, but they've let income inequality skyrocket, right? Right? Income inequality skyrocket so that the low SES. But it's also, Democrats are up against headwinds because anytime that they've had the majority, they've tried to push through legislation. Like, we waited from FDR until Obama to get some kind of national health care. Anytime they've had, and he really only got it because Nancy Pelosi is brilliant, right? So they've not had the kinds of, because of the erosion, right, of the civic infrastructure and pulling people in, so the Democrats, politics reflects who's organized and feeding it and who's got a megaphone out here, right? And so Democrats inevitably start responding because how do you win elections when all of that is gone? You win it with money and television ads as opposed to the organizing base. And so you get neoliberalism, right? You get responses to the donor base. Bill Clinton spent, not that I disagree with this necessarily, but Bill Clinton spent his first huge amount of political capital on gays in the military. Not an economic issue, right? Immediately after getting elected. Why? Because that's the base that helped him get elected by giving him money to pay for his campaign ads. So Democrats are up against huge it's not just Sherrod Brown, this is it coming to fruition. Democrats are up against historical headwinds that have made it really difficult for them to pass legislation that addresses concerns from people who have had their megaphone over the past several decades, the culmination of all sorts of different things, rip their voice away from them. The people the low socioeconomic status voters that are most likely to support Trump are the least involved in civic organized associations, right? And groups and clubs like this. And they're most likely to live in civic deserts. So I see it short-term and long-term, right? But then when you're angry, right, and feeling left behind, and someone stands up in a big, loud voice, and you might not think that Trump is actually really going to follow through and fix it, but someone says in a big, loud voice, "I hear you, and I'm going to fix that for you." Right? That's what people are responding to. Yeah, please.
Well, and you touched on what I think is a big factor is the economic divide.
Yeah.
I think it's huge in this country. We have 801 billionaires in the United States. The top 10% owns 90% of the wealth. All these, I don't know if that's accurate, but all this, I think, is what has really made this anger.
Yeah.
And there is awful anger. The CEO
Right.
in New York, that was an anger-related murder, if there ever was one, especially when you see them writing the bullets. And this anger is not going to go away.
No.
It's going to get worse until we address this issue. So who's addressing it? I don't see the Democrats doing it, and I don't see the Republicans doing it as well.
The problem is that the reason why we have so much income inequality is because the mechanisms that gave the working class voice and political power were disrupted. And so, more civic organizing, more bringing people in with low SES, creating these kinds of opportunities for everyone to belong to these kinds of clubs and groups and organizations, to make them cross-cutting. They used to be cross-cutting. My grandpa was, I don't know for sure that he had a college or a high school degree, was in an organization and in church with people who treated him well and listened to him and cared about the things that were affecting his life. That was replicate that all over the U.S. Now, the one thing that we have to work on with our civic organizations, and part of the reason why they died in the 60s and 70s, is that they were exclusionary. They cut across class status, but they were exclusionary based on race, religion, and gender. So we got to fix that before we put them back together. But that is, I saw a hand up over here too first, so maybe in the back. Yeah. And then I'll come back.
Direct it a little bit. In Ohio, we have a growing group of independent voters. I think it exceeds 50% now registered. Do you see a future first-party system either in Ohio or in the United States? Do you see that changing? And do you see possibly ranked choice voting coming into play?
So the first part was, do I see an opportunity for a third party? Was that the question?
Yeah, that was.
Okay, and then ranked choice. I think that you have a better shot at getting ranked choice than you do a third party. And they're playing around with ranked choice voting in some places, Alaska and a couple other places. And if it takes off and people like it, that might be something that that state legislators could grab onto or localities could grab onto.
Bluetooth disconnected.
But then the way that our elections are structured, the reason why they're capable of supporting third parties in places like Europe is that they have proportional voting, so that even if you vote, for a third party, that's not you'll at least get some representation in the legislature. And here, if you vote for a third party, like Jill, the Green Party, even though people voted for Jill Stein, is not going to get is not going to get like an eighth of the seats, in the legislature. So it's kind of like lost. So typically what happens in the United States instead is, as soon as there's a third party movement that is of any size to attract enough voters to make it worth their time, it gets absorbed. The policy agenda and what the platform that they stand for will get absorbed by one. So there's still a chance for change, but it would just get absorbed, and the two major parties would change their platforms.
Yeah, we have time for one more question because they actually have to open the restaurant. That kind of thing. It's fun.
So and I just kind of heard a snippet of this during the past week, and I was hoping there might be some excitement or information you had about it, the situation in Michigan with the Electoral College voting. Did you?
I haven't. I've been so swamped grading papers this week.
Did anybody else hear that? Where they were trying to get rid of the Electoral College.
National popular vote?
I don't know, it was in Michigan, and they were going to, they would count those votes from the Electoral College as individual votes, but not Electoral College votes.
I mean,
Did anybody else hear that story?
It's the national popular vote.
Is it the national popular
It's a
vote?
state-by-state thing, but they still have to cast electoral votes until we change the vote.
Until we get to
the only way that you could do it without a constitutional amendment is if enough states just agreed, like there's a consortium of states that agreed to change the way and say we will cast our electoral votes in accordance with the popular vote.
Well,
Yeah.
this time it wouldn't help.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, I got it. Thank you.
A huge thank you once again to Dr. Strachan, who to me is Cherie.